All right, so in this session, I'm going to take a look at the effects of different types of harvest methods on the ends of our microgreens. So one of the things that you hear people often discussing is what is the best way to cut your microgreens? And the two things it often comes down to are either scissors or a knife. Now, I am of the knife camp, and continue to be so. There are some situations where you need to use scissors, I find, but here I want to take a look at why we do that. So on your screen right now is the first of a few images I'm going to show. So this one here is the ends of a sunflower microgreen after being cut with scissors. And I'm not sure if my cursor shows up for folks here, but what you can see is that there's a lot of surface area. And what I mean by that is it's not smooth. There's a lot of bumps and edges and things like that. And in the world of decomposition, when we look at surface area, the idea is that the greater the surface area, the quicker things are going to decompose. And so when we think of composting materials, we chop it up into small pieces to make it easier to decompose. We chew our food to make it easier to digest. And so that's a function of surface area. And so here there's a lot of surface area because there's lots of sort of rips and tearing. It's not smooth. And every bump and every dip increases the surface area, which means the rate of decomposition is going to be a lot faster. So I see you're not seeing the cursor. That's fine. Hopefully you can see what I'm talking about here. So this is quite a jagged edge here. And this is, like I said, this has been cut with scissors. So next image here, same picture, just a little bit of different lighting. We can see that it's not very smooth. And so what we're doing is we're risking reducing the storage time or the storage aesthetic of our crop. Because if there's more damage on the end where things are cut, this is going to be the first place where you're going to see a decomposition happening. And this is going to be some browning or oxidation you're going to see on the ends of the of your cuts. Now, on a big microgreen like sunflower, this is quite easy to see. You can actually see it visually. The picture's not changing, really? Are you sure it hasn't changed? It's a very similar picture. Let's just take a look here. I'm going to change it again here. There might be a little bit of a delay, and let me know if this one changes as well or doesn't change as well. So this one is now an image of the ends cut with a very sharp knife. And so you'll notice the ends are a lot flatter. Okay, good. So now you're going to notice that the ends are a lot flatter and much smoother. So this now is our cut with a very, very sharp knife. And what you can see here is we actually have less surface area. There's no bumps, there's no dips, there's no valleys, there's no tearing at the edges. That's one of the things that happens with knives, because knives or with scissors don't really cut in the same way that a knife does. Scissors kind of tear, and it is the passing of the two blades across each other that causes the rip in things. So here we can see with our knife cut, we've got a very, very smooth surface. Where we do see bumps is just a little bit of a moisture coming out of the microgreen. So this is why I really like to push the knife as our cutting tool. It's also actually a much, much faster method. And so you'll find going through a tray with a knife, you can go through a tray, in 10 to 15 seconds, where with scissors, you're cutting in little sections, which takes a little longer. So next picture here, now we're moving on to a different cut. And so this is still with a knife, but this is with a dull knife. And so what happens as we cut is microgreens, even though they seem light and delicate, there's a lot of cellulose fibers within them. And when you're cutting dozens or hundreds of trays at a time, it is actually going to dull your knife a lot quicker than you would intuitively think. And so what happens as we're cutting trays is that as our knife gets more and more dull, the quality of our harvest is going to decline. So we're going to notice two things. Here you can see again, just like the scissors, there's a lot more surface area, a lot more tearing, things like that. And the other thing is it's going to get harder to push the knife through the microgreens. And so we end up kind of pushing a little harder and forcing it through. And this is where that saying of the most dangerous thing in a kitchen is a dull knife, is because if a knife isn't sharp, we force it through things a lot more than we would if it was really sharp. And when you have a really sharp knife with your microgreens, it cuts through them literally like a hot knife through butter. You literally barely need to push it through, and it's going to make a really, really nice clean cut. So we can see here, and I'm going to show another picture here also, where you can see a lot of the tearing. In the middle one, you can see where it's a little bit of the, there's a little bit of sort of like almost like a hangnail overhanging in the far end. So there's a lot of surface area there, and it's really going to affect the storage quality of our crops. So I really, like, the point here really is to make sure you're using the right method. And when you're cutting with a knife, you need to keep your knife sharp. So I do two things to keep my knife sharp. One is I do a literal sharpening before every harvest. So that means getting out the sharpening stone, oiling it up, giving the knife a really, really, really good sharpen before every harvest. And so 2 harvests a week, it means we're sharpening that knife 100 times a year, which means the knife isn't going to last as long as you'd like because you're going to use it a lot. The second thing I do is every second or third tray, I'm using a honing steel to hone the knife. And though this isn't necessarily, actually, it is not sharpening. What happens as a knife gets used is the blade gets what they say is wavy. It loses its straightness and becomes wavy. And so by using a honing steel, what it does is it takes that wave out and straightens the blade out again. So it's a way of maintaining the sharpness on your knife as opposed to sharpening it. And as I said, I will do that every 2 or 3 trays when doing a big harvest. So it ends up being something that takes a lot of time, but it also, in the end, it's going to save you time because you're going to be able to cut faster, and you're not going to be damaging your crop. Now, even though we're talking about scissors and knives here, if you were to use another method with a blade, like the quick cut greens cutter, for example, that blade is also going to need to be cut or sharpened on a regular basis. And so it's also one that you're not going to be able to hone like you do with a knife really quickly. So if you're using a cutter like that, you'll want to really keep an eye on the blade sharpness to make sure it stays sharp, to make sure your cutting keeps your microgreens at a high quality level. So I'm going to show one more image here, and this one here, you can see a little bit of blackening on the edges here. And so this is actually just moments after a cut, and this is actually just after I have sharpened the blade. And I gave the blade a quick wipe because I was just sort of wanting to get a cut in there. But what we see here is residue from the sharpening process. And so when you're sharpening and honing your knife, you also want to make sure you give it a good rinse and a good wipe before you take it back to the microgreens. That way you're not contaminating your microgreens with residue from your knife. So it's going to be part of your stone or part of your knife. And so theoretically, these could be tiny, tiny little particles of steel. And so what we don't want is tiny, tiny little particles of steel on our product. I'm actually thinking this is more likely residue from the stone, and maybe even is just a little bit of, like discoloration. But having seen this up close, and I'm also very careful about wiping my blade, it really speaks to the importance of using really good clean equipment for our product. So that's just a quick overview of the difference between cutting with scissors and a knife. I will stress, as I mentioned already, I really, really advocate using a knife for all cutting. It can be a little trickier with your finer microgreens, but what that often means is just having your knife be much, much sharper. So knife over scissors. Keep your knife sharp, which means sharpening it before each harvest and then honing it every few trays. And you should find that you're going to get really, really good quality cuts with all your products. So I hope that was useful, and good luck with your microgreens growing endeavors.